In 1912, 5 British men froze to death inside a Burberry tent, 12 miles from Salvation, at the bottom of the world. 90 years later, pubs across England were banning anyone who walked through the door wearing the same brand. The fabric that sheltered polar explorers and dressed kings had become the unofficial uniform of football hooligans and tabloid villains. And here's the part no one at Burberry will say out loud: the coat never changed. Not the stitching, not the cotton, not the 270 hand-sewn collar stitches made in the same Yorkshire factory by the same families for 50 years. What changed was who was wearing it. And in the economy of luxury, that is the only thing that matters. Chapter 1. The Draper Who Watched the Rain. Before Thomas Burberry invented anything, he stood in a field and watched shepherds refuse to come inside. It was Hampshire, sometime in the early 1850s. The rain came sideways across the chalk downlands, the way it always does in southern England. A low gray curtain that turns fields to mud and sends sensible people toward shelter. But the shepherds stayed out. Their heavy linen smocks, loose and coarse and nothing a gentleman would wear, shed the water like oilskin. The rain beaded on the surface, rolled off the weave, and fell to the ground. The men stayed dry. Thomas Burberry, barely out of his teens, apprenticed to a draper in the market town of Basingstoke, watched this happen again and again. And instead of seeing what everyone else saw, which was poor men in rough clothes doing rough work, he saw something else entirely. He saw a principle. The boy had no particular advantages. Born in 1835 in the Surrey village of Brockham Green, the son of a farmer, he had arrived in Basingstoke to learn the textile trade under a local outfitter. The work was ordinary: measuring cloth, cutting patterns, selling bolts of wool and cotton to the wives and servants of the county gentry. Victorian England in the 1850s was a nation being remade by industry, by railways, by new money pushing hard against old blood. A young man with sharp eyes and a willingness to work could build something from nothing, provided he understood what people actually needed. Thomas Burberry understood rain. The existing solutions for keeping dry were miserable. Rubberized Macintoshes, invented by Charles Mackintosh 3 decades earlier, trapped heat and sweat against the body until the wearer was as wet inside the garment as out. Heavy waxed canvas cracked in cold weather and stiffened until it could barely be worn. Oilskins stank. Wool absorbed water until it doubled in weight. Every waterproof fabric on the market solved one problem by creating another. What the shepherd's smock suggested was a different approach altogether. Do not coat the finished cloth. Treat the thread before it is woven. This was the insight that would take Thomas Burberry from a rented shop on Winchester Street to the wardrobes of kings and the edges of the known world. But the insight alone was not enough. Turning it into a usable fabric took years. Through the late 1850s and into the 1860s, Burberry experimented with yarn treatments, with weave densities, with the chemical properties of lanolin and other natural waterproofing agents. He was not a chemist. He was not an engineer. He was a draper who paid attention. By 1856, the year he opened his own outfitting shop in Basingstoke at the age of 21, Burberry was already testing his ideas on local customers: farmers, horsemen, gamekeepers, people who spent their working lives outdoors and who needed clothing that could survive the English climate without turning into a portable steam bath. The shop was modest. The ambitions were not. What Burberry eventually developed and patented was gabardine. The name itself came from a Shakespeare reference, a loose cloak worn in The Merchant of Venice, but the fabric was something entirely new. Each individual thread of Egyptian cotton was proofed against moisture before being woven into a tight twill pattern that created a double barrier. The yarn resisted water. The weave resisted water. But unlike rubber or wax, the fabric breathed. Air moved through it. Sweat escaped. The wearer stayed dry from the outside and comfortable on the inside. It sounds simple now. In 1879, when Burberry registered the gabardine trademark, it was revolutionary. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. By the mid-1870s, the Basingstoke shop employed over 80 people. Burberry had expanded from a single retail operation into a manufacturing enterprise, producing gabardine garments for a customer base that stretched well beyond Hampshire. The fabric found its first serious market among the British sporting classes: fox hunters, polo players, grouse shooters, cricketers who needed something that could handle a day at the crease without falling apart in an afternoon shower. These were not aristocrats buying luxury for the sake of display. They were practical people buying practical cloth for practical reasons. But Thomas Burberry had done something more significant than invent a useful textile. He had created a product that moved naturally upward through the British class system. The shepherds wore their rough smocks because they worked in rain. The sportsmen wore gabardine because they played in rain. The gap between working and playing is, in England, the gap between classes, and gabardine crossed it without anyone noticing. By 1891, Burberry had opened a shop in the Haymarket, the heart of London's gentlemen's retail district. The draper's apprentice from Basingstoke was now outfitting the upper reaches of British society from a premises steps away from Pall Mall and Piccadilly. And the fabric he sold them was, in its essential chemistry, the same principle he had observed decades earlier in a Hampshire field. Treat the thread, weave it tight, let the rain do what it wants. What Thomas Burberry could not have known, standing in his Haymarket shop at the end of the 19th century, was where that fabric would go next. Not to the county estates of southern England, not to the cricket grounds and grouse moors of the home counties, to the most extreme and unforgiving places on earth. Chapter 2: The Fabric That Conquered the Ice. Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole first, and he did it wrapped in Thomas Burberry's invention. The age of polar exploration was, among other things, an age of equipment failure. Men died not because they lacked courage, but because their clothing froze solid, their tents ripped apart in storms, their sleeping bags turned to sheets of ice that offered no warmth at all. The challenge was elemental. At the poles, temperatures dropped below -40 degrees, winds exceeded 100 miles per hour, and any moisture from breath, from sweat, from melting snow could kill a man faster than starvation. The explorers who survived were the ones who solved the problem of fabric before they solved the problem of navigation. Fridtjof Nansen was among the first to understand this. The Norwegian scientist and explorer, preparing for his 1893 expedition across the Arctic ice cap on the Fram, needed clothing and shelter that could withstand conditions no European textile had ever faced. He chose Burberry gabardine. The decision was not romantic, it was engineering. Gabardine's tight weave blocked wind. Its breathability prevented the interior condensation that turned other fabrics into death traps. Its lightweight, compared to the heavy furs and leathers traditionally used in polar travel, saved energy on every step of a journey measured in hundreds of miles on foot. Nansen survived. The gabardine survived. And word spread through the small, fiercely competitive world of polar exploration, that a Hampshire draper had solved one of the fundamental problems of travel at the extremes. What followed was a sequence of expeditions that reads like a catalog of human ambition at its most extraordinary and most reckless. Ernest Shackleton wore Burberry gabardine on his 1907 Nimrod expedition, reaching within 97 miles of the South Pole before turning back. He wore it again on the Endurance in 1914, surviving one of the most harrowing ordeals in exploration history after his ship was crushed by pack ice in the Weddell Sea. Burberry supplied the tents, the outer garments, the sleeping bag covers. But it is Robert Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition of 1910 to 1913 that fuses the Burberry name to the mythology of polar exploration forever. Scott and his four companions, Edward Wilson, Lawrence Oates, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans, reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, 1912, only to find that Amundsen had beaten them by 34 days. The return journey killed them. Evans collapsed first, then Oates, who walked out of the tent into a blizzard with the words that entered British legend. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers died together in their tent, trapped by a storm, just 12.5 miles from a supply depot that held food, fuel, and survival. The tent was Burberry gabardine. When a search party found their bodies 8 months later, the fabric was intact. The cotton had not rotted. The weave had not failed. The tent had done exactly what it was designed to do. The men inside it had simply run out of time. Consider the scale of what Burberry gabardine endured in a single generation of exploration. 1,117 miles of Arctic drift aboard the Fram. 72 hours of open Atlantic crossing with Alcock and Brown in 1919. Their Burberry flying suits caked in ice at 15,000 feet. The slopes of Everest with George Mallory and Andrew Irvine in 1924, last seen alive at 28,000 feet, climbing toward the summit in Gabardine. 5 men dead at the bottom of the world inside a tent that outlasted them all. The fabric Thomas Burberry had conceived by watching shepherds in the rain was now inseparable from the most extreme stories the British Empire could tell about itself. And the company understood the value of those stories perfectly. Burberry's advertising in the early 20th century leaned heavily on exploration imagery. The brand was not selling waterproof cloth to farmers anymore. It was selling the idea that its products had been tested at the limits of human survival. Every expedition that carried Burberry gabardine was, in effect, a marketing campaign conducted at the South Pole. The product was real, the performance was genuine, but the message was carefully shaped. This is what the bravest men on Earth choose to wear. That message was about to find its largest audience, not in the frozen South, not on the slopes of the Himalayas, in the mud and wire and relentless rain of northern France. Chapter 3. 500,000 coats for 500,000 officers. The War Office did not ask Thomas Burberry to clothe an army. It asked him to clothe the men who commanded one. When Britain entered the First World War in August of 1914, the military faced an immediate and practical crisis of clothing. The Western Front was, among its many horrors, spectacularly wet. Flanders and northern France sit on clay soil that turns to liquid under sustained rainfall. The trenches that defined the war filled with water, sometimes waist deep, that never fully drained. Men stood in mud for days. Their uniforms rotted. Their feet swelled with trench foot. Their greatcoats, heavy wool designed for marching, became waterlogged anchors that weighed soldiers down and offered no protection at all. The solution, for officers at least, was the Burberry trench coat. And the distinction matters. The British Army of 1914 was rigidly divided by class. Officers, drawn overwhelmingly from the public schools and the landed gentry, were expected to supply much of their own kit. Enlisted men received standard issue. When the War Office commissioned Burberry to produce a waterproof coat suitable for trench warfare, the order specified officers only. The coat was not democratic. It was a class marker sewn into military regulation. Thomas Burberry, now in his late 70s, adapted his existing designs to meet the specific demands of modern warfare with an engineer's precision. Every element of what we now call the trench coat was dictated by function. The D-rings on the belt were designed to hold grenades, map cases, and equipment. The shoulder epaulets displayed rank insignia. The gun flap, a reinforced panel across the right shoulder and chest, cushioned the recoil of a rifle. The throat latch sealed the collar against gas. The storm shield across the back channeled rain away from the body. The wrist straps tightened the sleeves to keep water out of the cuffs. The gabardine itself resisted the relentless moisture of the Western Front without the weight penalty of wool or the suffocating seal of rubber. 500,000 of these coats were produced during the war. The price ranged from £3 to £4 each, roughly equivalent to 3 or 4 months of a private soldier's pay. An officer purchasing his own Burberry trench coat was spending what an enlisted man earned in a quarter. The coat did not just protect its wearer from rain, it announced in unmistakable terms his position in the hierarchy of the British military and, by extension, British society. And then it announced something worse. German snipers on the Western Front learned quickly that British officers could be identified by their distinctive coats. The cut was different from enlisted men's greatcoats. The fabric was different. The fit was better. In the chaos of the trenches, where identifying enemy officers could break a unit's command structure, the Burberry trench coat became a target. The garment designed to protect its wearer made him easier to kill. This is the first instance of a pattern that would repeat throughout Burberry's history. A product designed for one purpose acquires a meaning its creators never intended. The trench coat was built for rain. It became a marker of class. That marker of class became a marker for death. The D-rings never held grenades for most of the men who wore the coat. The gun flap never absorbed rifle recoil in the trenches of the Somme. But the garment carried those associations into peacetime, and peacetime made them romantic. After the armistice in 1918, hundreds of thousands of officers returned to civilian life, still wearing their Burberry trench coats. The coat was practical. It was already paid for, and it carried the unspoken prestige of wartime service. A man in a trench coat in 1920 was not just a man wearing a raincoat. He was a man who had been there. The association between the Burberry trench coat and British authority, British class, British masculine competence was now permanent. It had been paid for in blood. Thomas Burberry himself died in 1926, at 90 years old. He had lived long enough to see his fabric reach the South Pole, cross the Atlantic by air, and clothe the officer class of the largest army Britain had ever fielded. The company he built was no longer a draper's shop in Basingstoke. It was a nationally significant manufacturer. Its products fused to the stories Britain told about its own greatness: exploration, warfare, endurance, command. But Thomas Burberry had also, without knowing it, created the conditions for everything that would follow. He had built a product whose meaning depended entirely on who was wearing it. In the hands of an explorer, Gabardine meant courage. On the shoulders of an officer, it meant authority. These meanings were not sewn into the fabric. They were projected onto it by the social position of the wearer. And social positions, unlike gabardine, are not waterproof. The coat was about to enter a world where its meaning would be rewritten by people Thomas Burberry had never imagined as his customers. And the instrument of that rewriting would not be the coat itself. It would be a small, caramel-colored pattern hidden inside the lining. Chapter 4. The lining that became more famous than the coat. The Burberry check was never supposed to be seen by anyone except the person already wearing the coat. Sometime in the 1920s, a tartan pattern of caramel, black, red, and white was introduced as the interior lining of Burberry trench coats. The exact date is disputed. The exact designer is unknown. What is certain is the purpose. It was a mark of authenticity, visible only when the coat was open or removed, a private confirmation to the wearer that they owned the genuine article. The check was not a fashion statement. It was a whisper, a small luxury hidden from public view. For decades, that is exactly what it remained. Through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the Burberry check lived inside the coat, known to wearers and to no one else. The brand itself grew steadily through this period, its reputation anchored to the trench coat, to its royal warrants, to its association with a particular kind of understated British elegance that valued quality over display. Burberry was not flashy. Burberry was reliable. The kind of brand a senior civil servant or a country solicitor might wear without anyone remarking on it, which was precisely the point. Hollywood accelerated the trench coat's mythology without Burberry spending a penny on placement. Humphrey Bogart wore a trench coat in Casablanca in 1942, and the image of him standing on the rain-soaked tarmac became one of the most iconic frames in cinema history. Audrey Hepburn wore one in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Marlene Dietrich wore one. Peter Sellers wore one as Inspector Clouseau. The trench coat became visual shorthand for a particular type of character. Worldly, composed, operating in morally ambiguous territory, but doing so with impeccable style. None of these actors were wearing specifically Burberry-branded garments. But Burberry was the trench coat, and every film that used the silhouette reinforced the brand's cultural authority. The check, meanwhile, began its slow migration from the interior of the coat to the exterior of the world. In the 1960s and 70s, the pattern appeared on scarves, umbrellas, and small accessories. It was adopted with enthusiasm by the Sloane Ranger set, the upper-middle-class young women of Chelsea and South Kensington, who treated certain brands as tribal identifiers. A Burberry scarf draped over a navy blazer was in that world a signal of belonging. The check had moved from inside the coat to outside it, but it was still circulating within its intended social class. The critical corporate decision that would eventually destroy this controlled circulation happened in 1955, when Burberry was acquired by Great Universal Stores, known as GUS. The conglomerate saw Burberry the way conglomerates see all acquisitions, as a revenue opportunity. Under GUS ownership, Burberry embarked on an aggressive licensing program that scattered the brand name across dozens of product categories and dozens of countries. In Japan, a licensed operation grew to extraordinary scale. 435 million euros in annual Japanese sales alone, generated by products designed, manufactured, and distributed by Japanese licensees with minimal oversight from London. In Spain, franchise operations controlled retail with similar independence. The Burberry name was on products that Burberry's own design team had never seen, in shops that Burberry's management had never visited, sold to customers Burberry's marketing had never targeted. This is the hidden architecture beneath the crisis that was coming. A luxury brand's value depends on control. Control of design, control of distribution, control of pricing, and above all, control of who encounters the product and in what context. US's licensing strategy surrendered every form of control except the financial one. Money flowed in, but the brand flowed out in directions no one at headquarters was tracking. Through the 1980s, the check migrated from accessories into ready-to-wear clothing. It appeared on shirts, on skirts, on baseball caps, on dog collars. Each product extension made the pattern more visible. Each new license made it more available. The check, which had begun as a private mark of authenticity hidden inside a coat lining, was now the loudest thing about the brand. You did not need to own a Burberry trench coat to recognize the check. You did not even need to own anything made by Burberry. The pattern had escaped the brand and entered the culture, and culture, unlike a trench coat lining, cannot be controlled. By the mid-1990s, the Burberry check was everywhere. It was on genuine products sold in Burberry stores. It was on licensed products sold in department stores. It was on gray market goods flowing through unauthorized channels. And increasingly, overwhelmingly, it was on counterfeits. The check pattern was simple enough to reproduce on any fabric, in any factory, at any quality level. Market stalls from Manchester to Manila sold Burberry check scarves, bags, hats, and phone cases for a fraction of the genuine price. The counterfeits were not parasites feeding on the brand's strength. They were symptoms of a pattern that had grown too famous, too recognizable, and too easy to copy for its own survival. The numbers were staggering. By the turn of the millennium, Burberry's global brand sales exceeded £2 billion annually, but the proportion generated by products the company actually controlled was shrinking relative to the ocean of licensed and counterfeit goods bearing its name. The United Kingdom represented just 7% of total revenue, yet British cultural perceptions of the brand were about to dominate global headlines. Because in Britain, something was happening to the check that no licensing agreement or marketing strategy had anticipated. It was being adopted with passionate enthusiasm by exactly the people luxury brands are designed to exclude. The question that was about to detonate at the center of Burberry's identity was not a question about fabric or quality or design. It was a question about class. And in Britain, questions about class are never really questions. They are verdicts. Chapter 5. The streets take what they want. No one at Burberry headquarters decided that football hooligans should become their biggest fans. It happened the way most cultural shifts happen, slowly, then all at once. Through the 1980s, a subculture emerged on the terraces of English football that would eventually reshape the meaning of British luxury fashion entirely. The casuals, as they became known, were working-class football supporters who replaced the traditional skinhead uniform of boots and braces with expensive European sportswear and designer labels. The logic was both aesthetic and tactical. Police identified football hooligans by their aggressive clothing. A man in a Stone Island jacket and Burberry scarf looked like a middle-class day tripper, not a threat. The brands became camouflage. Burberry was not the only label adopted by the casuals. Aquascutum, Stone Island, Fred Perry, Lacoste all circulated through terrace culture with varying intensity. But Burberry occupied a unique position. The check pattern was instantly recognizable, widely available through counterfeits, and loaded with precisely the class associations that made wearing it an act of cultural transgression. A working-class man in a Burberry cap was not just wearing a hat. He was wearing a symbol of the social world that excluded him, and he was wearing it on his own terms. The adoption was not aspirational in the way luxury marketing understands aspiration. It was confrontational. Through the 1990s, the Burberry check migrated from the football terraces into broader working-class youth culture. The pattern appeared on everything: bucket hats, tracksuits, bandanas, pushchair covers, car seat linings. Much of it was counterfeit. Some of it was genuine, purchased from Burberry's own expanded product lines. The distinction between real and fake became, in a strange way, irrelevant. The check was no longer a product. It was a cultural signal, and its meaning had been completely overwritten. In the language of the tabloids, the Burberry check had become the uniform of the chav. The word chav itself is loaded with the particular cruelty of British-class contempt. Used to describe young white working-class people perceived as loud, uneducated, and threatening, the term collapsed an entire social class into a caricature defined by clothing choices. And the Burberry check sat at the center of that caricature like a target. Then came the photograph. In 2002, the actress and soap opera star Daniela Westbrook was photographed in London's Bond Street, carrying her young daughter. Both mother and child were dressed head to toe in Burberry check. Westbrook wore a Burberry check skirt, a Burberry check top, and carried a Burberry check bag. Her daughter was in a matching Burberry check outfit in a Burberry check pushchair. The image was a cascade of the same pattern repeating across every surface of two human beings. The tabloids ran it everywhere. It became, instantly, the single most damaging image in the history of the brand. The cruelty of the reaction was specific and deliberate. Westbrook was a woman with a publicly known cocaine addiction and a working-class background. The tabloids did not frame the photograph as a fashion error. They framed it as evidence of what happened when the wrong people got hold of luxury goods. The subtext, often barely sub at all, was that Westbrook's class disqualified her from wearing the brand. The same outfit on a duchess would have been eccentric. On Daniela Westbrook, it was grotesque. The message was not about aesthetics. It was about permission. Pubs across England began banning the Burberry check. Not specific Burberry products, the pattern itself. Door policies listed it alongside football colors and gang insignia as prohibited attire. Golf clubs refused entry to members wearing it. The check had become, in the public imagination, a marker not of luxury, but of threat. The same pattern that signaled Sloane Ranger respectability in 1980 now signaled antisocial behavior in 2002. The threads were identical. The meaning was inverted. Consider the numbers that framed this crisis. Burberry's global sales exceeded £2 billion. The counterfeiting industry had scaled to industrial proportions, with factories in China, Turkey, and Southeast Asia producing Burberry check goods by the container load. The UK market represented approximately 7% of Burberry's total revenue, a fraction of the Japanese and American businesses. Yet British newspaper coverage, British tabloid photographs, British pub bans were shaping how the world understood the brand. A fashion editor in New York, a buyer in Tokyo, a luxury consumer in Milan. All of them were seeing the same Daniela Westbrook photograph. All of them were drawing the same conclusion. The crisis was not commercial in the immediate sense. Burberry was still profitable. The Japanese licenses still generated hundreds of millions in revenue. The trench coat still sold to wealthy customers who would never set foot in a football ground. But luxury is not ultimately a commercial proposition. It is a semiotic one. The product must mean the right thing, and meaning is controlled not by the company that manufactures the product, but by the culture that consumes it. Burberry had lost control of what its most famous symbol meant, and it had lost that control not to a competitor, not to a scandal, not to a product failure, but to the terrifying democratic force of popular desire. People wanted the check, the wrong people, and wanting it was enough to destroy it. What Burberry did next revealed something that most luxury brands would prefer to keep hidden. Something about the true economics of what they sell and the extraordinary measures required to maintain the fiction that a product is worth what the price tag claims. Chapter 6. 90 million pounds of burning clothes. For 5 consecutive years, Burberry set fire to its own products, and the accountants called it rational. The practice is called inventory destruction, and within the luxury industry, it is as routine as a quarterly earnings call. When a product does not sell at full price, the brand faces a choice. It can discount, which reduces the perceived value of every other product bearing the same name. It can donate, which risks the garment appearing on someone the brand does not want wearing it. It can warehouse the stock indefinitely, paying storage costs on an asset that depreciates with every passing season. Or it can destroy it entirely, burn it, shred it, dissolve it in acid, remove it from existence so that the illusion of scarcity, which is the foundation of luxury pricing, remains intact. Burberry chose fire. In the fiscal year ending March 2018, Burberry destroyed 28.6 million pounds worth of unsold goods. This was not an anomaly. Over the preceding 5 years, the company had destroyed approximately 90 million pounds worth of product. Clothing, accessories, fragrances, finished goods that had been designed, manufactured, shipped, warehoused, and cataloged, every cost incurred, every resource consumed, only to be incinerated before a single customer could buy them at a reduced price. The justification, within the logic of luxury, is airtight. A Burberry trench coat retails at £1,990. That price is sustained not by the cost of the gabardine, which is perhaps 40 or 50 pounds of Egyptian cotton and manufacturing. It is sustained by the collective belief, shared by buyers, investors, fashion editors, and the broader culture, that a Burberry trench coat is worth £1,990. The moment that same coat appears in a discount outlet at £490, the belief cracks. If it can be bought for $490, the argument goes, then the $1,990 was always a fiction. And if $1,990 is a fiction, then so is the entire price architecture of the brand. Burning the stock is cheaper than the alternative. The 28.6 million pounds destroyed in a single year is a fraction of the billions in brand value that would erode if those goods entered the market at reduced prices. Accountants call this rational. The language of the annual report called it controlled. Journalists called it something else. When the Times and subsequently other British outlets reported the scale of Burberry's destruction program in 2018, the reaction was furious. This was not a secretive practice. The figures were disclosed as required in Burberry's annual reports. But there is a difference between a line item buried in the notes to a financial statement and a headline that reads, "Burberry burns 28 million pounds of stock in 1 year." The public saw waste. Environmental campaigners saw ecological vandalism. Social commentators saw the obscenity of burning clothing, while homelessness and fuel poverty affected millions. The burning scandal exposed the hidden mechanics of an industry that sells aspiration while practicing destruction. Burberry was not alone. LVMH, Kering, Richemont, Every major luxury group engaged in similar practices. But Burberry, already weakened by the Chav crisis, already carrying the cultural baggage of a brand that had become synonymous with class anxiety, took the heaviest reputational damage. The company was forced to announce, in September 2018, that it would immediately stop burning unsold stock and would begin working toward making its products from sustainably sourced materials by 2025. But the deeper revelation of the burning was not environmental, it was economic. The luxury industry's entire pricing model depends on the maintenance of artificial scarcity. There must always be fewer products available than there are people who want them. When supply exceeds demand, when the check appears on every market stall and every football terrace and every discount rack, the system breaks. The response is not to lower prices. The response is to destroy supply, to reduce the number of objects in the world bearing your name until the ratio of desire to availability returns to the level that sustains your price. This is the machinery that the Burberry story reveals. The shepherd's smock that became gabardine, the gabardine that became an officer's coat, the officer's coat that became a cultural icon, the cultural icon that became a counterfeit, the counterfeit that became a class marker, the class marker that became a crisis, and the crisis that was resolved not by making a better product, but by burning the products that already existed. The cycle is not a malfunction. It is the system operating exactly as designed. Luxury does not sell objects. It sells the distance between the object and the ordinary person's ability to obtain it. When that distance collapses, the object must be withdrawn, reimagined, or destroyed. Burberry, at the turn of the millennium, was facing all three options simultaneously. The check had been hijacked. The counterfeits were everywhere. The stock was burning. And someone needed to decide, with real money and real consequences, which version of Burberry would survive. The answer would come from an unlikely source, a woman from the Bronx who had left one of the most prestigious jobs in American retail to take over a company that everyone in her life thought was beneath her. Chapter 7. The woman who left Fifth Avenue for a mess. Rose Marie Bravo's parents flew to London, looked at what their daughter had taken over, and asked why she had left Saks. It was 1997. Bravo, a 51-year-old Italian-American executive, had just resigned as president of Saks Fifth Avenue, one of the most coveted positions in American luxury retail, to become chief executive of Burberry. The reaction from the New York fashion establishment ranged from bewildered to pitying. Saks was Fifth Avenue. Saks was Manhattan. Saks was the pinnacle of the American department store tradition. Burberry was a dusty British outfitter whose most recognizable product was a raincoat and whose most visible customers were increasingly people the fashion industry preferred not to acknowledge. Bravo saw something the New York establishment missed. She saw a brand with extraordinary heritage, global name recognition, and a product, the trench coat, that had genuine historical significance. What Burberry lacked was not quality or history. It lacked desire. No one wanted Burberry. People respected it the way they respected a reliable family solicitor, competent, trustworthy, utterly without glamour. Bravo's mission was to make Burberry desirable. And she understood, from 2 decades in American retail, that desire is manufactured through images. Her first move was to hire Mario Testino, the Peruvian-born photographer who had become the most sought-after fashion image maker in the world. Testino's photographs were warm, sensual, and drenched in light. They made everything they touched look young and alive and expensive. His first campaign for Burberry, shot in 1998, featured the British model Stella Tennant. The images were a declaration. This is not your grandfather's raincoat brand. This is fashion. Then Bravo hired Kate Moss. The model was, at the time, the most famous face in the industry. She was also, crucially, associated with a raw, youthful, slightly dangerous edge that was the opposite of everything Burberry had traditionally represented. Moss in a Burberry trench coat, photographed by Testino, created an image that collapsed the distance between heritage and cool. The photograph said, "You can want this. Young people can want this. Beautiful, fashionable, culturally current people want this." The strategy worked with devastating efficiency. Burberry's revenue surged. The brand opened new stores. The stock price climbed. Magazine editors who had ignored Burberry for decades began featuring it in editorial spreads. Celebrities adopted the trench coat. Red carpets displayed it. The Burberry check, amplified by the new marketing energy, became more visible than ever. And this was the paradox that Bravo's success created. Her entire strategy depended on making Burberry desirable to a wider audience. But widening the audience of a luxury brand is like opening the valve on a pressure system. You cannot control where the desire flows once you release it. Bravo made the check fashionable. The football terraces made it tribal. The counterfeiters made it ubiquitous. The process was the same in each case. People saw the pattern, wanted it, and found a way to get it. The only difference was the price they paid and the social class they belonged to. Bravo's compensation reflected the scale of what she was attempting. Her total remuneration package reached $9.2 million, making her one of the highest-paid executives in European retail. She was the daughter of a Bronx hairdresser, a woman who had grown up in an Italian-American working-class household and climbed to the top of two of the most class-conscious industries on earth, fashion and British luxury. The irony of her position was almost too neat. She was a working-class woman who had earned the right to lead a brand whose crisis would be caused by working-class people wearing its products. By the time Bravo stepped down as chief executive in 2006, she had transformed Burberry from a moribund heritage label into one of the most talked-about fashion brands in the world. Revenue had grown dramatically. The brand was desirable again, but the price of that desirability was already visible in every tabloid photograph, every pub ban, every counterfeit scarf on every market stall from Liverpool to Lagos. Bravo had not caused the Chav crisis, the licensing regime under G. Yus, the counterfeiting explosion, the specific dynamics of British class warfare. These were forces far larger than any single executive. But she had accelerated the conditions in which the crisis could flourish. She had made the check famous, and fame, in luxury, is the most dangerous thing a symbol can achieve. The task of undoing that fame would fall to someone who understood Burberry not from the vantage point of Fifth Avenue or Bond Street, but from the factory floor of Yorkshire, someone who had grown up close enough to the looms to hear them. Chapter 8. The Yorkshire Boy Who Killed the Check. Christopher Bailey grew up 30 miles from the factory where Burberry trench coats are made, and his first major act was to dismantle the brand's most recognizable symbol. Bailey was born in 1971 in Halifax, West Yorkshire, a town built on the textile industry and slowly declining as that industry moved overseas. His father was a carpenter. His mother was a window dresser for Marks and Spencer. He grew up in a world where fabric was not abstract. It was labor. It was livelihood. It was the thing that paid the mortgage or did not. When he arrived at Burberry in 2001 as design director, rising to chief creative officer and eventually chief executive, he brought with him an understanding of the brand that was rooted in something deeper than fashion magazines or advertising campaigns. He understood what the products meant to the people who made them. But understanding was not enough. The brand was in crisis, and the crisis demanded surgery. Bailey, working alongside Chief Executive Angela Ahrendts from 2006 to 2014, executed a strategy so radical that it amounted to the deliberate destruction of the brand's most famous visual asset. The check was reduced from 20% of visible product to under 5%. 20% to under 5%. This was not a subtle adjustment, it was an amputation. The Burberry check, the pattern that had defined the brand for 3 generations, that had adorned Sloane Rangers and soap stars and football casuals and counterfeit bags from Shanghai to Shepherd's Bush, was effectively removed from public view. Baseball caps, the single product most associated with the chav stereotype, were discontinued entirely. Not redesigned, not repositioned, removed from existence. Then came the licenses. The sprawling network of third-party manufacturers who had scattered the Burberry name across products and markets worldwide was systematically dismantled. The Spanish franchise operation was bought back. The Japanese license, which alone generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue, was terminated. The fragrance business, previously licensed to an external company, was brought in-house. Each of these decisions involved the deliberate sacrifice of short-term revenue for long-term brand control. Terminating the Japanese license meant walking away from one of the most profitable licensing arrangements in the history of fashion retail. But the license also meant that products bearing the Burberry name were being sold in Japan that Burberry's London team had never approved, in stores whose visual presentation Burberry could not control, to customers whose relationship with the brand Burberry could not shape. The replacement strategy centered on the trench coat itself, not the check, the coat. Bailey and Ahrendts understood that the trench coat was the one asset whose authenticity could not be counterfeited, whose heritage was real, and whose association with quality, craftsmanship, and British history was immune to the class contamination that had destroyed the check. You could fake a check pattern on a baseball cap. You could not fake 270 hand stitches on a gabardine collar. In 2009, a year before Instagram launched, Burberry created the Art of the Trench, an online platform that invited customers to upload photographs of themselves wearing their trench coats. It was, in effect, a social media campaign before social media existed in its current form. The platform did something strategically brilliant. It allowed Burberry to curate who was seen wearing its products. Not every photograph was displayed. The images that made it onto the platform were beautiful, diverse in a carefully controlled way, and unmistakably aspirational. The Art of the Trench was Burberry retaking control of its own visual narrative. The results, measured financially, were extraordinary. Revenue grew by 27%. Market capitalization tripled to £7 billion. Burberry returned to the FTSE 100. The brand was, by any commercial measure, saved. But the strategy had human costs that the financial statements did not capture. In 2007, Burberry closed its factory in Treorchy, in the Rhondda Valley of South Wales. The factory, which had produced polo shirts and other garments for the brand, employed 309 people in a community where alternative employment barely existed. The closure provoked national outrage. Workers marched from the factory gates accompanied by the Treorchy Male Voice Choir. Members of Parliament demanded intervention. A petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Burberry offered relocation packages to its Castleford factory in Yorkshire. But Treorchy was not Castleford. It was a Welsh Valley town where the factory was not just an employer, but a reason the community existed at all. The Treorchy closure illustrated a truth about brand transformation that fashion magazines rarely acknowledge. When a luxury company restructures itself, the cost is not borne by the executives making the decisions. It is borne by the workers whose labor is deemed surplus to the new strategy. Bailey's plan to refocus Burberry on the trench coat required eliminating products and production lines that did not serve that vision. The polo shirts made in Treorchy did not fit the narrative of heritage craftsmanship anchored to a single iconic garment, so the factory closed. And the 309 people who had stitched Burberry products in that valley went home. Bailey himself, by the time he departed in 2018, had earned millions in compensation and transformed Burberry from a troubled brand into a global luxury powerhouse. The check was gone. The counterfeits had faded. The trench coat was ascendant. But the story was not over, because the pattern that Bailey had spent a decade erasing was about to return, summoned back by a generation that remembered the crisis differently. Chapter 9. The Pattern That Refused to Die. Burberry spent a decade erasing the check from existence, and then a new generation brought it back on purpose. The years after Christopher Bailey's departure in 2018 saw Burberry cycle through creative directors with an almost frantic rhythm, each one attempting to answer the same impossible question. What is this brand now? Marco Gobbetti, hired as chief executive, brought in Riccardo Tisci, the Italian designer known for his work at Givenchy. Tisci replaced the classic check with a new monogram pattern, redesigned the logo to strip away its Victorian equestrian heritage, and attempted to position Burberry as a streetwear-inflected luxury house in competition with Balenciaga and Off-White. The pivot was jarring. Longtime customers did not recognize the brand. New customers were not convinced by it. Then the pandemic hit. Luxury retail collapsed worldwide. Burberry stores in China, which had become the brand's most critical growth market, shuttered. Tourism, the engine of European luxury sales, stopped entirely. The industry that had spent a century selling the dream of beautiful things worn in beautiful places was suddenly irrelevant in a world where no one was going anywhere. Gobbetti departed. Jonathan Akeroyd arrived, and with him came Daniel Lee, a Yorkshire-born designer who had made his name revitalizing Bottega Veneta with a strategy of quiet luxury and understated craft. Lee was, in some ways, a mirror of Bailey. Born in Bradford, educated at Central St. Martin's, shaped by the same West Yorkshire landscape that had produced the Burberry trench coat. His appointment felt like a homecoming. Lee's most provocative decision was the one that everyone in the industry had assumed was permanently off the table. He brought the check back, not tentatively, not as a subtle interior detail returned to its original hiding place. The check came back loudly, unapologetically, draped across entire collections. Coats, bags, shoes, scarves, all rendered in the caramel, black, red, and white pattern that Bailey had spent a decade burying. Lee's argument was generational. The people who associated the check with the Chav crisis of 2002 were now in their 40s and 50s. A new generation, raised on irony and remix culture, saw the check differently. For them, the pattern was not a class marker. It was an icon. Its very controversy made it interesting. The campaign that crystallized this argument was extraordinary. The musician and artist FKA Twigs filmed herself walking through a gray London estate, pushing a pram, dressed head to toe in Burberry check. The image was an unmistakable echo of the Daniela Westbrook photograph that had nearly destroyed the brand 20 years earlier. Mother, child, check, council estate. Every element was the same, but the framing had inverted. Where the Westbrook image was tabloid cruelty, the FKA Twigs image was fashion art. Where Westbrook was mocked for her class, Twigs was celebrated for her daring. The same pattern, the same configuration, an entirely different meaning. The campaign generated enormous attention, but attention and revenue are not the same thing. Burberry's financial performance under Lee's initial tenure was mixed. Revenue peaked at £2.97 billion, suggesting that the check's return had commercial energy. Then it fell. By fiscal year 2025, the numbers told a sobering story. Revenue had declined to £2.46 billion. Operating profit had collapsed to $26 million, a margin so thin it barely qualified as profitable. The company announced plans to eliminate 1,700 jobs worldwide. The stock price, which had peaked during the Bailey and Ahrens era at levels reflecting a £7 billion market capitalization, had retreated sharply. The luxury market itself was contracting, hit by slowing Chinese demand, a global cost of living crisis, and a generational shift in spending patterns that favored experiences over objects. Burberry was not the only house struggling. Kering, parent of Gucci, reported similar declines. But Burberry's position was more precarious because its brand identity was less settled. Chanel was Chanel. Hermès was Hermès. Burberry was still, after 170 years, trying to decide what it was. A heritage brand, a fashion brand, a British institution, a global luxury house, the check, the coat, the factory, the myth. Daniel Lee was betting that the answer was all of these things at once, that the check could be reclaimed, that the Westbrook photograph could be rewritten by the FKA Twigs campaign, that the same pattern could mean danger and beauty, exclusion and belonging, shame and pride, depending on who was looking and when. It was the same bet the brand had been making since a draper in Basingstoke watched shepherds in the rain and saw not poverty, but possibility. Whether it would pay off this time was a question that went far beyond fashion. It went to the heart of how objects acquire meaning, how meaning is controlled, and what happens when control is lost. The answer, as it had always been with Burberry, was in the stitching. Chapter 10. 270 Stitches That Never Changed. Paul Brown has worked at the Castleford factory for over 45 years, and his brothers and his wife have worked there too. The factory sits in West Yorkshire, in a landscape shaped by the textile industry, the way a river shapes its valley. The stone mills that once produced wool for half the world still stand along the valley floors, though most of them now house flats or small businesses or nothing at all. Castleford itself is a working town, not a fashion capital. The people who live here are not the people who buy Burberry trench coats at £1,990. They are the people who make them. Inside the factory, the process of constructing a heritage trench coat unfolds across more than 100 individual hand production stages. The gabardine arrives from the weaving mill at Keighley, 30 miles to the northwest, where it is still produced on looms using Egyptian cotton yarn that has been proofed before weaving, exactly as Thomas Burberry specified over a century ago. The fabric is cut, assembled, and finished by workers whose skills cannot be replicated by machines because the tolerances involved are too precise and the judgments required are too subtle for automation. The collar alone requires 270 individual stitches, each placed by hand. A new worker must complete a 12-month apprenticeship before being permitted to stitch a collar unsupervised. The training is not theoretical. It is muscle memory, built over thousands of repetitions until the hands know the spacing without measuring, and the fingers feel the tension without thinking. Paul Brown learned this decades ago. His brothers learned it. His wife learned it. The skill passes through families the way farming knowledge passes through farming families. By proximity, by repetition, by a shared understanding that this is how we live. The D-rings are still there. The storm flap is still there. The gun flap is still there. The epaulets, the throat latch, the wrist straps. Every element that Thomas Burberry designed for the officers of the First World War persists in the coat being stitched in Castleford today. The elements have lost their military function entirely. No one hangs grenades from the D-rings. No one displays rank on the epaulets. But the details survive because they are the physical markers of the coat's history, the stitched proof that this object has a story that predates everyone alive. During the pandemic, when the fashion industry shut down and the concept of luxury clothing became briefly absurd, the Castleford workers did something that connected them directly to the Burberry tradition they had inherited. They retooled the factory. The same hands that stitched trench coat collars began producing personal protective equipment for the National Health Service. 160,000 individual pieces of PPE gowns and masks made from the same manufacturing discipline that produced 270 stitch collars, assembled by the same families who had worked the same factory floor for generations. The gesture was not symbolic, it was practical, but it was also, in its way, a return to origins. Thomas Burberry invented gabardine because people needed protection from the elements. The trench coat was commissioned because soldiers needed protection in the trenches. The PPE was produced because healthcare workers needed protection during a pandemic. The through line is the same: fabric, cut, and assembled by skilled hands, designed to keep people safe. Outside the factory, the brand lurches from crisis to crisis, from creative director to creative director, from check to no check, to check again. Inside the factory, the work continues. The looms at Keighley produce gabardine. The cutters at Castleford cut patterns. The stitchers stitch collars. 270 stitches, every time. Chapter 11. The Royal Warrant and the Car Park. King Charles III renewed Burberry's royal warrant in 2024, but in Basingstoke, the chapel Thomas Burberry built is gone. The royal warrant is one of the oldest instruments of brand endorsement in the world. Granted to companies that supply goods or services to the British monarch, it carries no financial value in itself. What it confers is permission. Permission to display the royal coat of arms. Permission to state, in print and on packaging, that the holder is a supplier to the king. In the architecture of British luxury, the warrant is the highest floor. Burberry has held one, in various forms, for over a century. Its renewal in 2024, following the accession of Charles III, confirmed the brand's continued place in the most exclusive circle of British commerce. The Haymarket store endures too. The shop that Thomas Burberry opened in 1891, steps from Piccadilly and Pall Mall, still operates as a Burberry flagship. The address has changed from a draper's outfitter to a luxury retail destination, but the location is the same. The continuity is real. The FTSE 100 listing survives, though its position has become precarious. Burberry's market capitalization, which peaked at £7 billion during the Bailey and Arendts era, has contracted significantly. The company remains one of the few British-owned luxury brands of global scale, but its financial performance no longer commands the confidence it once did. In Basingstoke, the story is different. The town where Thomas Burberry opened his first shop in 1856 has moved on. The mission hall that Burberry funded is gone. The congregational chapel where he worshipped is gone. The Crossways development that replaced much of the old town center is now itself partially demolished and replaced by a car park. Winchester Street, where the original shop stood, bears no trace of the man who built a global empire from its pavement. A small plaque exists somewhere in the town. Most residents walk past it without stopping. In Antarctica, the traces are more durable. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers still lie beneath the ice of the Ross Ice Shelf, entombed in the glacial flow that has carried them slowly northward for over a century. Their Burberry tent, or what remains of it, is down there with them. The ice preserves what the living world discards. The gabardine that kept its weave intact through Antarctic storms has outlasted the town that produced it, the man who invented it, and the empire whose stories it was woven into. The distance between these remnants is the distance of 170 years. A shop on Winchester Street, a tent on the Ross Ice Shelf, a factory in Castleford, a warrant from the king, a car park where a chapel stood. Burberry's physical legacy is scattered across the world in fragments, each one carrying a different chapter of the same story. The coat endures, the pattern endures, the factory endures, the brand endures, though its shape keeps changing. What does not endure is the certainty of what any of it means. Thomas Burberry was a draper who watched the rain. His great contribution was a fabric that kept people dry. Everything else, the mythology, the class associations, the check, the crisis, the burning, the billion-pound valuations, was built on top of that simple, useful thing by people who understood that the value of an object is never contained in the object itself. Chapter 12. Who gets to wear the coat? The trench coat that Thomas Burberry designed for the trenches of 1914 is, in every essential detail, the coat being stitched in Castleford today. The same gabardine, the same weave, the same cotton, grown and proofed and woven at Keighley on looms that have been updated but never fundamentally redesigned. The same D-rings, the same storm flap, the same gun flap that no longer absorbs rifle recoil and has not done so for over 100 years. The same 270 hand stitches in the collar, placed by workers who learned the technique from workers who learned it from workers who learned it in a chain of transmission stretching back decades. The coat is, materially, the same object it was when 500,000 of them were shipped to the Western Front. And yet, the coat has been, in succession, a shepherd's practical garment, an explorer's survival tool, a military officer's class marker, a sniper's target, a Hollywood archetype, a fashion statement, a counterfeit template, a symbol of social exclusion, a burning sacrifice to the god of artificial scarcity, and a 1,990-pound piece of wearable heritage. The thread did not change. The meaning never stopped changing. This is the thesis that 170 years of Burberry history makes unavoidable. Luxury is not a property of objects. It is a property of permission. The permission to charge 1,990 pounds for a coat whose material cost is a fraction of that price depends on a collective agreement shared by the brand, the buyer, the culture, and the market, that the coat is worth what it costs. That agreement is not about cotton. It is not about stitching. It is not about D-rings or storm flaps or 12-month collar apprenticeships. It is about who is seen wearing the coat and what their presence says about the world the coat belongs to. When Roald Amundsen wore Burberry to the South Pole, The coat meant human triumph over nature. When a British officer wore it in the trenches, it meant command and class. When Humphrey Bogart wore it in Casablanca, it meant romantic danger. When a football casual wore it on the terraces, it meant defiance. When Daniela Westbrook wore it head to toe on Bond Street, it meant vulgarity. When FKA Twigs wore the same configuration 20 years later, it meant art. The gabardine was identical in every case. The meaning was determined entirely by the body inside it. The luxury industry depends on the maintenance of boundaries between these meanings. The entire system of pricing, marketing, distribution, and brand management exists to ensure that the Amundsen meaning and the Bogart meaning prevail over the Westbrook meaning. When the boundaries fail, when the wrong meaning attaches to the product, the industry responds with the tools at its disposal. Discontinue the product, burn the stock, hire a new creative director, launch a new campaign, and spend whatever it takes to reassert the correct interpretation. But the Burberry story proves that these boundaries are, by their nature, temporary. A product that is desirable will be desired. Desire does not respect class boundaries. It does not honor price tags. It does not ask permission. When enough people want something, they will find a way to have it, whether through purchase, counterfeiting, or sheer cultural appropriation. And when they do, the meaning of the object shifts, whether the brand consents or not. Gabardine began in a Hampshire field with shepherds who needed to stay dry. It reached the South Pole. It crossed the Atlantic. It sheltered officers and drew sniper fire. It lined the wardrobe of the British establishment. It was replicated in factories from Shenzhen to Istanbul. It was burned in warehouses to protect a price point. It was banned from pubs. It was dressed on a soap star and mocked across the tabloids. It was dressed on a musician and celebrated across the fashion press. It was stitched through all of this in the same factory by the same families with the same 270 stitches in the collar. The question Burberry's history leaves us with is not about fashion or branding or the future of a single British company. It is about the nature of value itself. If the worth of a thing depends entirely on who is holding it, then worth is not a quality of the thing. It is a quality of the social system that surrounds it. The coat is just cotton, the check is just thread. The price is just a number. Everything else, the meaning, the prestige, the permission, the power, is a story we tell about who gets to wear what. And stories, unlike gabardine, are never waterproof. In Castleford, the looms are running. The cutters are cutting. The stitchers are placing 270 stitches in a collar, one after another, the same way they did yesterday and the day before and the decade before that. The cotton is still growing. The yarn is still being proofed. The weave is still tight. Whatever the brand becomes next, whatever the check means tomorrow, whatever name the next creative director carries, and whatever vision they impose, the coat will be there. The same coat. The only thing that changes is who gets to wear it. And in the economy of luxury, that has always been the only thing that matters.